Senor, you're looking so good there, ready to take on America.
Oh God, am I ever. My name is Roger Dennis Hawley. I've lived in the Hawaiian Islands for over 52 years. And over those years, I've come across some intriguing documentation pertaining to the late president's untimely assassination. I would like to reveal to the American public documentation that will show that there is no question that the suspect that was personally exercised by the Warren Commission was a complete frame-up and a complete lie to the American public. So I'd like to start off by going into some of these documents and reading them verbatim as I've come across them over the last 43 years. I've been involved in investigating this horrible incident of the cold-blooded murder of our late President John F. Kennedy. So anyway, let me start off by saying that for the last 24 years, I have been a close associate and a personal friend of our great entertainer, Willie Nelson. This is a portrait of the two of us taken some 15 years ago at his private home in Maui, Hawaii. And I have shared some of the evidence with him, and he is unquestionably mind-blown by the evidence I've uncovered. So let's start with some of the hardest evidence that has ever been presented to the American public. I would like to point out that this book here by the former governor of Minnesota, Jesse Ventura, came out years ago and completely documented the fact that Lee Harvey Oswald was 100% innocent. I would like to go through 3 of his chapters, word for word, and after just listening to these 3 chapters, if you haven't already come to the conclusion that Lee Harvey Oswald was innocent, by the time I finish, I believe that there won't be not even one person that will believe the Warren Commission and the Warren Report. Here it goes. This is written by the former governor, Jesse Ventura, back over 5 years ago. Chapter 1. Oswald had no motive for murder. Now I'm going to tell you a fact that often overlooked, but is very important. In addition to not having the means to commit the crime, Oswald did not possess a sufficient motive. Neither the Warren Commission nor the House Select Committee on Assassinations was ever able to establish any motive for Oswald to have committed the crime. That's a big red flag to any real investigator. Why did he do it? It's your basic crime scene 101. They couldn't even come up with a good reason, so that's why they always just described him as some kind of a lone nut. Since when does such a high-profile crime not need a motive? Why did Oswald do it? To this most important and most mysterious question, the commission had no certain answer. It suggested that Oswald had no rational purpose, no motive adequate if judged by the standards of reasonable men. But in addition to not having any motive, just the opposite appears to be the real story here. Oswald, and not many people know this, is on record as having admired President Kennedy. After his arrest, he told the police that my wife and I like the president's family. They are interesting people. He said, I am not a malcontent. Nothing irritated me about the president. Chapter 2. The x-rays showed that the bullet particles were from exploding ammunition. It was originally researcher Harold Weisberg who proved something very important. The actual x-ray showed the bullet particles fragmented extensively in the president's head, which means the Marlicher Carcano couldn't have fired the bullet, as our Marlicher only shoots a full metal jacketed bullet. All military weapons by NATO and the Geneva Convention, like the Marlicher, are not allowed to shoot fragmented bullets from them. So the bullet out of the weapon would have to be a full metal jacket bullet, which does not break into pieces. So with Kennedy's actual x-rays showing particles of bullets, that tells you that the bullet was not from that gun. The conclusion to reach from that is very simple. The bullet that hit President Kennedy in the head could not have come from the crime scene rifle that they said they linked to Oswald. Other scientific studies substantiate the fragmentation. First of all, listen to the exact words of one of JFK's morticians, Tom Robinson, when testifying to Congress about the fatal bullet. Robinson said that it exited in many pieces, and then explained they were literally picked out, little pieces of this bullet from all over his head. In further support, moreover, we can go back to the statements of autopsy assistant James Curtis Jenkins and recall that in the exact spot where he claimed the doctors discovered a gray discoloration of the skull, Dr. Davis saw metallic fragments, which he assumed were in the scalp. A gray discoloration of the skull, of course, suggests the presence of lead. Lead is, of course, a metal. 2 + 2 = 4. When one realizes that the largest fragments of an exploding bullet travel the furthest, and that the two largest fragments discussed at the autopsy were on the opposite ends of Kennedy's skull and the equidistant from our proposed entrance, and adds this to the fact that defying expectation, there were no small fragments surrounding the supposed in-chute in the cowlick, then one should rightly conclude that the lateral X-ray demonstrates convincingly that the bullet broke up near the site of the supposed outshoot above the right ear. Fragmenting bullets that explode on impact, also known as fragmentable bullets or hot loads, are not consistent with the rifle alleged to be used in the assassination. Oswald's rifle, as the authorities like to call it, was not the type that handled fragmental ammo, but numerous bullet fragments were found inside the president's limo. Some that were standard ammo, others that were apparently from fragmentable bullets. Another factor, the measure of velocity of the shots, also shows that they are two different weapons. Professor Jim Felcher approved all of this in this scientific study of the weapons and the ammo. Here are his findings. The weapon that Oswald is alleged to have used could not have fired the bullets that killed JFK. The carbine was not a high-velocity weapon. Everyone, including Gerald Posner, agrees that the muzzle velocity of the Marlicher Carcano was 2,000 feet per second. The death certificates, autopsy report, and Warren Commission declared that he was killed by the high-velocity bullets. High velocity would be 2,600 feet per second and up. The shot striking the right forehead was from a fragile or exploding bullet, as evidenced by the extensive shock waves of the damage through the brain. Oswald's bullets were standard copper-jacketed military ammunition, which could not have inflicted fragile damage. So Oswald's rifle could not have inflicted the specific type of damage present in the president's wounds, and the Oswald's bullets could not have caused the specific type of damage or have left the type of bullet fragmentation that was found in that car. Chapter 3. Hearings before the President's Commission on the Assassination of President Kennedy. Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to listen to this very carefully, as it's quite well documented. The testimony of Dr. Charles J. Carrico. The testimony of Dr. Charles J. Carrico was taken at 12:30 a.m. on March 25, 1964, at Parkland Memorial Hospital, Dallas, Texas, by Mr. Arlen Specter, Assistant Counsel of the President's Commission. Mr. Specter, may the record show that Dr. Charles J. Carrico is present in response to a letter request for him to appear so that his deposition may be taken in connection with the proceedings of the President's Commission on the investigation of the assassination of President Kennedy. In connection with the inquiry into all phases of that assassination, including medical care rendered at Parkland Memorial Hospital, Dr. Carrico has been asked to testify relating to the treatment which he rendered the president at Parkland Hospital. With that preliminary statement of purpose, Dr. Carrico, would you please stand up and raise your right hand? Do you solemnly swear the testimony you will give before the President's Commission is in this deposition proceeding will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God. Dr. Carrico, I do. Attorney Inspector, would you state your full name for the record, please? Charles James Carrico. What is your profession, sir? Physician. Are you duly licensed by the state of Texas to practice medicine? Yes. And would you outline briefly your educational background, please? I attended grade school and high school in Denton, Texas, received a Bachelor's of Science in Chemistry from North Texas State College in 1957, and a MD from Southwestern Medical School in 1961, and served an internship at Parkland Memorial Hospital from 1961 to 1962, and a year of fellowship in surgery at Southwestern, followed by my residency here. Are you working towards any specifically specialty training, doctor? I'm engaged in a general surgery residency which will qualify me for my boards in general surgery. And what were your duties on November 22nd, 1963 at Parkland Hospital? At that time, I was assigned to the elective surgery service and was in the emergency room seeing other patients for evaluation for admission to the hospital. And what were you doing specifically around 12 o'clock noon? Approximately 12 noon or shortly thereafter, I was in the clinic and was called to come into the emergency room to see these people and to evaluate them for admission and treatment. Were you notified that there was an emergency case on the way to the hospital at approximately 12:30 p.m.? Yes. Would you continue to describe your observations of the president's color? I don't believe I said he was an ashen blue, gray, syntonic. He was making no spontaneous movements. I mean, no voluntary movements. We opened his shirt and coat and tie and observed a small wound in the anterior lower third of the neck. Listened very briefly, heard a few cardiac beats, felt the president's back, and detected no large or sucking chest wounds, and then proceeded to the examination of his head. The large skull and scalp wound had been previously observed and was inspected a little more closely. There seemed to be a 4 to 5 centimeter area of avulsion of the scalp, and the skull was fragmented and bleeding cerebral tissue. The pupils were inspected and seemed to be bilaterally dilated and fixed. No pulse was present, and at that time, because of the inadequate respirations and the apparent airway injury, a cuffed intraductal tube was introduced, employing a laryngoscope. Through the laryngoscope, there seemed to be some hematoma around the larynx, and immediately below the larynx was seen the ragged tracheal injury. The intratracheal tube was inserted past this injury. The cuff inflated, and the tube was connected to a respirator to assist the inadequate respiration. At about this point, the nurse reported that no blood pressure was obtained. Dr. Kriko, with respect to this small wound in the anterior third of the neck, which you have just described, could you be any more specific in defining the characteristics of that wound? This was probably a 4 to 7 millimeter wound, almost in the midline, maybe a little to the right of the midline and below the thyroid cartilage. It was, as I recall, rather round, and there were no jagged etches or stellate lacerations, which shows a frontal wound. Here is an amazing story that just recently came out in the Dallas Morning News, Tuesday, September 17th, 2019. Dr. Robert McClellan was a Dallas surgeon in that operating room where John Kennedy died. This is the testimony of Dr. Robert Nelson McClellan as reported by the report of the President's Commission on the Assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Testimony of Dr. Robert Nelson McClellan. The testimony of Dr. Robert Nelson McClellan was taken on March 21st, 1964 at Parkland Memorial Hospital, Dallas, Texas, by Mr. Arlen Spector, Assistant Counsel of the President's Commission. Mr. Spector, and what has provided the opportunity for your experience here at Parkland in residency training and on the staff with respect to acquiring knowledge of gunshot wounds? Largely, this has been related to the type of hospital which Parkland is, namely city county hospital, which receives all of the indigent patients of this county, many of whom are involved frequently in shooting altercations, so that we do see a large number of that type patient almost daily. Could you approximate for me the total number of gunshot wounds which you have had an opportunity to observe? I would estimate that it would be in excess of 200. What was your duty assignment back on November 22nd, 1963? At that time, I was showing a film on surgical techniques to a group of students and residents on the second floor of the Parkland Hospital in the surgical suite, where I was notified of the fact that President Kennedy was being brought to Parkland emergency room after having been shot. And what action, if any, did you take following that notification? Immediately upon hearing that, I accompanied the resident Dr. Crenshaw, who brought this news to me, to the emergency room and down to the trauma room 1, where President Kennedy had been taken immediately upon arrival. And approximately what time did you arrive in emergency room 1? This is a mere approximation, but I would approximate or estimate rather about 12:40 p.m. And who was present, if any, at the time of your arrival? At the time of the arrival, Dr. Perry, would you like the full names of all these? That would be fine. I would appreciate that. What did you observe, if anything, as to the status of the neck wound when you first arrived? The neck wound when I first arrived was at this time converted into a tracheotomy incision. The incision had been made by Dr. Perry, and he told me, although I did not see that he had made the incision through a very small, perhaps less than 1/4 inch in diameter wound in the neck. Do you recall whether he described it any more precisely than that? He did not at that time. Has he ever in any more precisely for you? He has since that time. And what description has he given of it since that time? As well as I can recall, the description that he gave was essentially, as I have just described, that it was a very small injury with clear cut, although somewhat irregular margin of less than a quarter-inch in diameter, with minimal tissue damage surrounding it on the skin. Now, was there anything left for you to observe of that bullet wound, or had the incision obliterated? The incision had obliterated, essentially the skin portion, that is. It shows that it was definitely a frontal wound. Here is a book that came out years after the assassination. It was called Best Evidence. It was a New York Times bestseller. It was by David S. Lifton, and he went into the deepest resources of his investigation ability. Now, with startling new disclosures, Best Evidence pieces together the shocking facts behind John F. Kennedy's assassination. David Lifton's skilled analysis leads one irrefutable conclusion that the plot did not begin in the twisted mind of a lone assassin, but was a successfully executed conspiracy that reached to the highest levels of the federal government. Lifton's obsession with unanswered questions has led him again and again to best evidence that the president's body fell into the hands of people who deceived the nation and the world, and who, to this day, have not been brought to justice. There is no factual claim in Lifton's book that is not supported by intriguing evidence, meticulous, well-documented, and valuable. Here is a couple of paragraphs that should sum it all up. On January 8th, 1983, I visited with nurse Trish Gustafson, formerly nurse Patricia Hutton, on November 22nd. She met the presidential limousine in the parking lot and ran with the stretcher carrying the president to the emergency room. She had placed a bandage against the wound at the back of his head. She was unequivocal. The large throat wound shown in the photographs was not the tracheotomy incision that she saw in the emergency room on November 22nd, 1963. It doesn't look like anything that I've taken part in. Let me put it this way. And the head wound was at the back, not as shown in the pictures. I was standing behind him when I was putting pressure on his head, she said, and it was right in front of me. It wasn't around the side and up on top. Shown the large hole is on the forward right-hand side, depicted in the x-rays of photos 31 and 32. She exclaimed, "No way." Here's a photograph taken after the autopsy that shows that the tracheotomy entrance that they put a tube in was enlarged like 3 times bigger than what the original Dr. Perry had put. One doctor I didn't see in 1983 was Dr. Malcolm Perry, the man who performed the Dallas tracheotomy shortly after President Kennedy's body left Parkland Hospital. Dr. Perry held a news conference at which he stated 3 times that the president was shot in the throat from the front. The wound was 3 to 5 millimeters. He told Humes the morning after the shooting in 1966. Dr. Perry told me his incision, though that wound was 2 to 3 centimeters, see page 238, in 1979. Researcher Robert Gruden, a consultant to the House Assassination Committee, was present at an unofficial private arranged meeting when Dr. Perry was shown an autopsy photograph clearly showing the throat wound. Dr. Perry looked at the picture and shook his head from side to side, and then, on the condition that he not be quoted, gave this reaction: tracheotomy was too large. It was not the track that he had made. He said the throat wound in the picture was larger, expanded, and that his was neater. Dr. Perry said the head wound was not the way he remembered it either, and that the picture published in 6 Seconds in Dallas, a picture prepared by Dr. McClellan and similar to my figure 20 was much closer of Dr. Perry's reaction. Groden said, "It was one of the most vivid memories I have of this case. I knew it was important. I knew it was historic." Groden first told me of the meeting with Perry shortly after it occurred. He has honored Dr. Perry's confidence these many years, but has now given me permission to quote what Dr. Perry said in 1979 because Dr. Perry has recently told the television program Nova that he sees no discrepancy between the tracheotomy incision he made and the tracheotomy wound depicted in the doc's drawing. The photo rendition of the autopsy photograph shows the throat wound. Here's another shot of that throat wound. Here is something that is mind-blowing. This is from the New York Times, right after the so-called Warren Commission made the ruling that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. And the evidence of the doctors proves that it had to be at least 2, possibly 3 or 4 people involved in the assassination. The evidence we have uncovered so far in over 45 years is that the Supreme Court Chief Justice Earl Warren and the former late President Gerald Ford told a big whopper. Lies, lies, lies. Here's a side shot of our late president right after he was murdered in cold blood. Here is an interesting thing. This is from the Warren Commission report. This is where our late President Lyndon Baines Johnson committed a first-degree felony against the state of Texas. While the team of doctors at Parkland Hospital tried desperately to save the life of President Kennedy, Mrs. Kennedy alternated between watching them and waiting outside. After the president was pronounced dead, McConnell tried to persuade Mrs. Kennedy to leave the area, but she refused. She said that she intended to stay with her husband. A casket was obtained and the president's body was prepared for removal. Before the body could be taken from the hospital, 2 Dallas officials informed members of the president's staff that the body could not be removed from the city until an autopsy was performed. Despite the protests of these officials, the casket was wheeled out of the hospital, placed in an ambulance, and transported to the airport shortly after 2 p.m. At approximately 2:15 p.m., the casket was loaded with some difficulty because of the narrow airplane door. Onto the rear of the president's plane were seats that had been removed to make room. Concerned that the local officials might try to prevent the plane's departure, McDonald asked that the pilot take off immediately. He was informed that takeoff would be delayed until President Johnson was sworn in. The end of the trip. Swearing in of the new president. From the presidential airplane, the vice president telephoned Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, who advised that Johnson take the presidential oath of office before the plane left Dallas. Federal Judge Sarah T. Hughes hastened to the plane to administer the oath. Members of the presidential and vice presidential parties filled the central compartment of the plane to witness the swearing in. At 2:38 p.m., Lyndon Baines Johnson took the oath of office as the 36th President of the United States. Mrs. Kennedy and Mrs. Johnson stood at the side of the new president as he took the oath of office. 9 minutes later, the president's airplane departed for Washington, D.C. Return to Washington, D.C. On the return flight, Mrs. Kennedy sat with David Powers, Kenneth O'Donnell, and Lawrence O'Brien. At 5:58 Eastern Standard Time, Air Force One landed at Andrews Air Force Base, where President Kennedy had begun his last trip only 31 hours before. Detailed security arrangements had been made by radio from the president's plane on the return flight. The public had been excluded from the base, and only government officials and the press were permitted near the landing area. Upon arrival, President Johnson made a brief statement over the television and radio. President and Mrs. Johnson were flown by helicopter to the White House, from where Mrs. Johnson was driven to her residence under Secret Service escort. The president then walked to the executive office building where he worked until 9 p.m. Ladies and gentlemen, this unquestionably is the number one smoking gun that shows most likely the number one suspect of the mastermind of the killing of John F. Kennedy. This is a segment of a biography about the president's late brother-in-law, Peter Lawford. His original birth certificate name was Peter Sidney Ernest Allen. He was born in 1923 and died December 24, 1984. In the biography by James Spada, this one chapter is unquestionably unbelievable. Early in 1961, Peter Fairchild, restaurateur, set out to sue his wife, a starlet named Judy Meredith, for divorce citing adultery. Fairchild hired Fred Otosh to assemble evidence that Judy had sexual affairs with a number of men in Hollywood. When the complaint was prepared for submission to the court, the men were listed as Dean Martin, Jerry Lewis, Frank Sinatra, etc., etc., etc. Word got out that one of the etceteras was President Kennedy, and before long, Otosh got a call from Johnny Roselli. He wanted to meet with Otosh at the Brown Derby restaurant in Hollywood at the request of the Attorney General. Warily, Otosh agreed. I'm sitting there with Johnny Roselli, Otosh recalled, and two FBI men are covering the meeting. Roselli says to me, "Listen, Otosh, you've got yourself a problem. You're in trouble. You're fucking around with the White House here. What's this shit that you're going to name Jack Kennedy as a correspondent in Judy Meredith's divorce case? How can you name the President of the United States in a divorce case?" I said to him, "He fucked my client's wife. That's how. Who the fuck is that cocksucker? Who are you representing anyway?" He said to me, "I'm representing the Kennedys." I said, "Are you kidding me?" I couldn't believe my ears. Here's Roselli, a guy who's a fucking mobster, intervening on behalf of the White House. I used to have the prick under surveillance. I used to put guys like him in jail. Now he's representing the president. I'm sitting there thinking, wait a minute, what is this bullshit? There were other meetings, at least one of which Sam Giancana attended. Roselli asked Otosh what it would take to straighten things out. Otosh replied, "Very simple. Judy wants $100,000. My client isn't going to give her shit because I'm going to name Frank Sinatra as a guy who was fucking her, Sammy Davis as a guy who was fucking her, Gene Martin as a guy who was fucking her, Jerry Lewis, Jack Kennedy. My client has a real case for divorce and he ain't giving her a dime. Why don't you have the Rat Pack throw a charity show? Give Judy the money and the case will go away." By the morning of the court hearing on the Fairchild divorce, nothing had been resolved. I went into that courtroom, Otosh says, prepared with the documents to have the complaint amended and name John Kennedy. I'm in the judge's chambers and I've got all the papers, and all of a sudden somebody hands a clerk a check to Judy's lawyers, and the matter is settled. She got what she wanted. She sure as hell didn't get it from her husband, my client. She got it from somebody else. Giancana, Roselli, and their fellow mobsters understandably expected that with their various assistances to the Kennedy administration, the FBI would turn a blind eye to their illegalities. Bureau wiretaps in December 1961 recorded this exchange between Giancana Roselli concerning the mob donations to the Kennedy campaign. Sinatra's got it in his head that the Kennedys, are going to be faithful to him and by extension the mob. Giancana, the godfather of Chicago. In other words, then, the donation that was made. That's what I was talking about. In other words, if I ever get a speeding ticket, none of those fuckers would know me. You told that right, buddy. Giancana hadn't told it right at all. Not only did J. Edgar Hoover's men not lessen their campaign against the mafia, they dramatically increased it. Attorney General Robert Kennedy had set as one of his highest priorities of his department the destruction of what he called the enemy within, and said, I'd like to be remembered as a guy who broke the mafia. Kennedy authorized surveillance, harassment, and wiretaps of Giancana, Roselli, and dozens of other mob figures. On February 27, 1962, Hoover sent Robert Kennedy a memorandum that outlined some of the information the Bureau's in surveillance had revealed. Judy Campbell had made phone calls to both Sam Giancana and the White House. The White House calls, Hoover told Bobby, were apparently being made to the president's secretary, Evelyn Lincoln. Bobby undoubtedly told his brother about the memo, but the relationship between Jack, Judy, and Giancana didn't stop. Hoover informed that Campbell's calls to the White House had not ceased since his memo to Bobby Kennedy. Met with the president on March 22nd to tell him that his department was aware of his affair with Campbell and her relationship with Giancana. Here's a fascinating photograph of the book depository building, and supposedly this is where Lee Harvey Oswald was firing the 3 shots that supposedly hit Kennedy. But it's really ironic. If you see this tree right here, this is a photograph of that tree through a telescope on top of this Marlicher Carcano rifle. So the majority of the entire motorcade was completely hidden by the tree. Within 2 weeks after FBI took that photograph and did a reenactment of the assassination, this mysterious tree here and there was cut down in the middle of the night. And the next morning, the employees that worked at the book depository shook their heads and they said, "What happened?" And apparently the tree was taken out, so the Warren Commission would not have that as evidence. Here is something that is beyond shocking. I waited over 40 years for this story to appear somewhere in the national media. This story is probably poo-pooed by a lot of adult Americans that it's all phony and everything. But it's dated December 21st, 2018. When it came available on the counters of a grocery store here on the island of Maui, I grabbed one copy and I proceeded to read it in total utter shock. This is going to be the summation of my entire case, to completely exonerate the memory of Lee Harvey Oswald as being a suspect of the assassination of our late great President John F. Kennedy. Listen to these words. These words were locked away in the National Archives for over 40 years. The Examiner World Exclusive. Heartbroken Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis swore Lyndon B. Johnson and an evil group of greedy Texas tycoons were behind the assassination of her husband, President John F. Kennedy. That bombshell is just one of the shocking secrets the fiercely private former First Lady dropped in a treasure trove of recently released tapes long buried in the guarded vault. According to intelligence sources, more than 20 years after Jackie's death, from cancer in 1960 at 64 in 1994, the National Examiner can rip the lid off the sophisticated socialites' blockbuster revelations, which finally tell the truth about JFK's shooting in Dallas and expose Jackie's sexy affair with Hollywood hunk William Holden. Vice President Johnson was sworn in as the commander-in-chief on November 22, 1963, hours after Jackie's spouse was gunned down in cold blood, allegedly by former U.S. Marine Lee Harvey Oswald. But Jackie was absolutely convinced Lyndon Johnson was a pawn in the hands of a cabal of high-powered Texas businessmen who expected LBJ would give them favorable treatment in Vietnam War contracts and oil policies once he was in the Oval Office, says a mole. On these tapes, Jackie doesn't disguise her contempt for Johnson or her suspicion that he would stop at nothing to get to be the president himself. The insider quotes Jackie as saying, "I'm convinced Lee Harvey Oswald couldn't have killed Jack on his own. Everything I've learned about that man suggested that he really was a patsy or even part of a larger plot." Jackie's confessions come from recordings made in 1964, mere months after JFK's murder. She intended for them to stay under lock and key until 50 years after her death. Though some of the tapes were released to the public early by Jackie and JFK's daughter, Carolyn, a Kennedy insider insists, quite obviously, Carolyn held some things back. This is mind-blowing. One of those things that Carolyn held back is the fact that 2 weeks before Kennedy was murdered, Kennedy called Johnson into the Oval Office and said he's no longer necessary for the 1964 campaign. But insiders with access to the stunning secret recordings say that they include revelations that Jackie discovered her husband was having an affair with a 19-year-old White House intern when the First Lady found the teen's underwear. They also allegedly disclosed how JFK's infidelities drove Jackie into the arms of Sunset Boulevard star William Holden and the Fiat head Giancarlo Agnelli. Jackie regarded the pretty young things in the White House as superficial flings for Jack. She did retaliate by having her own affairs, says Edward Klein, who authored several books about the Kennedys. There was a period during which she was delighted to be able to annoy her husband with her own illicit romances. But for all of her public discretion and stoicism, insiders say Jackie let loose in private when talking about her late husband's former running mate. She claimed JFK only made the Texan his number 2 because he needed a Southerner to balance the ticket and more votes. Jack said to me sometimes, he said, "Oh God, can you ever imagine what would happen to the country if Lyndon were president?" Jackie confessed. Even more disturbing, she recalled her husband joking about being assassinated. I remember Jack saying after the Cuban Missile Crisis, when it all turned out so fantastically, he said, "Well, if anyone's ever going to shoot me, this would be the day they should do it," she remarked. But Jackie wasn't the only person who believed Johnson had Jack's blood on his hand. According to the 2013 book, The Man Who Killed Kennedy, the case against LBJ, the vice president, was a desperate guy who was facing ruin because JFK planned to drop him from the presidential ticket for the November 1964 election. The power-hungry vice president was able to find plenty of willing partners who hated the Kennedys to help him execute the brazen plot, states the book's author, Roger Stone, who claims LBJ got away with murder. The entire compilation of this evidence should be recorded on YouTube as JFK Farensic Files 101. I think that's our appropriate title for this revelation. It's unfortunate. I've been a fan for the late president for over half a century. I felt it was my duty to change the attitudes of some 30% of the American adult population, because of last year, 2019, there was still about 30% of the American adult population believed that Lee Harvey Oswald was the assassin of Kennedy, which is definitely, with evidence so overwhelming as I presented, it should go all the way to the widow of Mrs. Oswald to know that her husband, once and for all, was completely chosen as the patsy for this incredible murder. JFK Forensic Files 101. This is Roger Dennis Hawley, the 8th, speaking on behalf of the late president, and rest his soul. Aloha.